Well, I am John Ipple. I'm the Executive Director of Amplify GR from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I just wanted to share a little bit about some of the great work that we're doing in Grand Rapids. And our mission is we strive to widen pathways so that all residents in our neighborhoods have real opportunities to benefit and to participate in neighborhood growth. And the way that we do that is entirely through partnerships. And so we have many of those partners here this week. And we're feeling pretty poised about the successes that we've had so far. So just a couple of quick highlights. We have successfully have renovated over 100 houses in the neighborhoods that we're working with so far, with both homeowners and with other nonprofits that are converting those into affordable quality rental housing. We've also brought in 4 employers that have now employed over 100 people. And are committed to local hiring, paying livable wages, and giving second chances to returning citizens. So we feel pretty happy about that. And we're poised for our next phases of redevelopment in the Boston Square area of our neighborhood that's going to ultimately produce 250 mixed income housing units, 50,000 square feet of retail, an amazing early learning center, and a 1-acre park. And so we are really excited about this work. But as I said, the only way that we can do that is through partnership. And so some of our partners here are the Oakdale Neighbors, the Boston Square Neighborhood Association, our elected officials, Bryn Shore, the Early Learning Neighborhood Collaborative, just to name a few. And so again, this is all through partnership. But Grand Rapids, like many of your cities, is a city of contradictions, right? We are a city that now has the highest population of its history, has experienced billions of dollars in development over the last couple of years, yet only 1.5% of those investments have occurred in the third ward where we work. And so the disparities are significant. We are one of the most giving communities in the entire country, yet we have some of the highest lead exposure of young children in the entire state, right? So these tremendous disparities continue to exist in our community. And gun violence. We are a safe city that had just a few murders a couple years ago, but has experienced a huge rash of gun violence over the last year. And so many of us have been firsthand experienced or witness to some of those violent acts. And so we are a community that feels motivated and positive about the good things that are happening, but also challenged by the immense work that lays ahead of us. So a lot of this work and some of these statistics I shared because it directly relates to our next speaker, Patrick Sharkey, and some of the amazing work that he's doing. Professor Sharkey, this is the second time that he's been here at the Purpose-Built Communities Conference. Last time he talked about his findings in the book called Stuck in Place, Urban Neighborhoods and the End of Progress Towards Racial Equity, which demonstrated the link between neighborhoods and intergenerational poverty. His work has been very important to our network to help understand why and how poverty in the United States is tied to place. It's the work that we do on a daily basis. This year, he will be talking about the findings in his latest book, Uneasy Peace, which is available for you to take home, and most of you probably have grabbed that by now. And one of his key findings for us is that an Uneasy Peace was the relationship between nonprofit community development organizations and the national decline of urban crime in the 1990s. And this is very relevant to the work that we do. So can you please give a warm welcome to Professor Patrick Sharkey.
Thank you all for being here on this last day of the conference and for inviting me here. I was saying to John that I've had a stint, just by coincidence, a lot of travel packed in to a short period of time, and it leaves you exhausted. And then, on the tour yesterday, you take the turn on the Eva Davis Way, and you see what has happened in Eastlake. And, I was able to talk with Eva Davis's granddaughter, Shannon, and it just fills you with renewed energy. And so it's really a gift to be able to join you here. I'm extremely grateful. It's been fun to talk with many of you over the past couple of days. And it's an honor. I introduced myself yesterday as the only person not doing anything useful in the room, and it is, I can say sincerely that I'm just really impressed and at times just in awe of the work you're doing. So I'm very grateful to be here. I want to start by talking about this city where we've gathered, Atlanta. And I was actually here a couple weeks ago and asked these same questions to a different audience and got some very interesting responses. So I figured I'd repeat this experiment and see what you have to say. So I'm going to give you two statements about Atlanta, and I want you to tell me whether you think they're true or false. And the first one is that Atlanta used to be one of the most violent big cities in the country. Okay, so let me be more specific. And yeah, there's the slides, great. And ask, okay, so if we look at the murder rate in the largest big cities in the country, let's say the 100 largest big cities in the country, back at the start of the 1990s, how many people think that Atlanta was one of the most violent, let's say top 20 most violent cities? Okay, so those people think that's true. How many people think that statement is false? Okay, way too many abstentions here. Let's try it again. How many people think the statement is true? Atlanta was one of the top 20 most violent. Okay. How many people think it was false? How many people just don't know? That's cool. Okay. All right. Let's fast forward. So I would say it's a little bit over half think Atlanta was one of the most violent cities in the country. Now let's fast forward to the present, okay? And as of last year, this is statement number 2, Atlanta, as of last year, was one of the most violent big cities in the country, top 20 most violent big cities in the country. How many people think that statement is true? Okay, a few. How many people think that statement is false? Okay, and how many people don't know? Okay, thanks for your honesty. Okay, so if you were one of the few people who raised your hands and thought both of those statements were true, you were correct. Atlanta, so let's take a look at the, let's hopefully take a look here. Is there another way to advance these? Okay, well, I'll show you a couple maps once we get this going. There we go. Maybe. The first map that I will show you in a sec is from 1990. Okay, and this comes from, actually, you could look it up on, this is from a website I put together called AmericanViolence.org, and the point of the website is to try and deliver the most accurate, up-to-date data on how violence is changing in big cities across the country. And so the first map shows the murder rate across the country in the 100 largest cities, and what it shows, so all the cities are arranged by what the murder rate was in 1990. What it shows that Atlanta was one of the 2 or 3 most violent places in the country back then. Okay, the murder rate was, I think, close to 60 murders for every 100,000 people. And so right now, that would make Atlanta one of the most violent places in the world. Okay. Now, when you fast forward and go to 2018, Atlanta doesn't have that same level of violence. So now it's not one of the 2 or 3 most violent cities in the country. Now it's about 14 or 15. And the rate is now just below 20 murders for every 100,000 people. So for those of you who weren't sure about whether that stat is right now, you were onto something. Something fundamental has changed. Now the third statistic that kind of helps, there we go. Okay, so this is the original map in this one's from 1991. Okay, now I get control of this, all right. So this first map, these cities are the size of the city and the shade of the city represents how high the murder rate was. And that first map showed Atlanta. I'll try to walk you through it again. Okay, this is the updated map. Let's see how we're doing. All right, now we're good. Okay, so 1991 map, 2018 map, you can see that Atlanta is not quite at the top in terms of most violent city in the country, but still among the most, it's about 14 or 15. Now this is a third statistic. This is how the murder rate has changed in Atlanta from the early 1990s to the present. And so what you can see is at the start of this period, as I said, Atlanta would have been one of the most violent places in the nation, in the world, if you put it against all the countries of the world. Like the most violent countries in the world right now have murder rates around 60 murders for every 100,000 people. And this is in a very small number of countries across the world. In lots of cases, war-torn countries, Honduras, El Salvador, places plagued by the violence that comes with the drug trade. Now, at the end of this period, the rate is 17 or 18 murders for every 100,000 people. So we've seen this dramatic change that has occurred, and yet your ambivalence about these questions or your uncertainty about these questions reflects something bigger about how to interpret these changes. Violence has fallen all over the country. In lots of places, it's fallen by as much as it has in Atlanta. Violence has fallen by 70% in Atlanta. This is a different city than it was in the early 1990s, and yet no one feels content. And there are lots of reasons for that. And one is that not everyone is certain about how violence is changing. Most of us don't live in the most intensely violent places. Most of us are not the victims of a violent crime. So we have a perception of violence that is formed in part by media, it's formed in part by politicians, and it's formed in part by who we know and what kinds of work we do. Okay, but it's imperfect, and it's very biased. But secondly, the methods that we've relied on to deal with violence over the past 50 years, not just the past 20 years, have brought about a huge degree of despair, have brought about their own challenges and problems and injustices, like mass incarceration, like aggressive or violent policing. And so no one really feels content with the changes that have taken place. In a lot of places, the residents who fought to make those changes are no longer in those communities, priced out as rents rise around them. And then we have an additional problem, which is that not every neighborhood is safe. Not every city is safe. We have a problem that some neighborhoods haven't been touched by the crime drop. Okay, I know there are folks here from Detroit, where the rate of violence hasn't fallen much, Baltimore, St. Louis. John was saying in Grand Rapids there's a new spike in violence. Okay, so this drop of violence has put us in a place where in the history of the United States, we're now living through the safest period in our country's history. But compared to the rest of the world, we're still a violent country. Okay, and there are lots of cities and neighborhoods that still have extreme violence. So this is kind of the dual message of this talk, that we've experienced this transformative change in what city life means in the United States. We've entered this new period, at least relatively, a period of American peace, but it's an uneasy peace, and that's the motivation for the title of the book. Okay, so I'm going to frame this talk around three central questions. And the first one is why violence? And let me answer more specifically, why am I talking about violence? So you all work in communities, a lot of the communities you work in are probably dealing with this challenge on a day-to-day basis. I am a red-headed white guy who lives in Princeton, New Jersey, and so what gives me the right or the credibility to talk about violence? And the answer is, I sometimes wish like I had this compelling story to tell about how I got, it always works better like if I was jumped on the way to work one and had this epiphany about the importance of violence. That's not what happened. So what happened is the data brought me here. The evidence brought me here. So I got into this line of work because I cared deeply about injustice and inequality. That's why I became a social scientist. I wanted to understand it in order to be able to work against it. And as I started learning how to work with data and being able to interpret data, I started to see how the deepest injustices and inequalities in the United States lay in the places where people lived, in the environments in which we raise our kids. And this is particularly true if you look at the places where white Americans live compared with every other group, and particularly compared to black Americans. So this is from my first book that I talked about at a conference here several years ago, where I looked at the environments in which different groups of Americans live over long periods of time and multiple generations. And kind of the core finding that drives the rest of the book is that over the past 2 generations, just over half of African American families have lived in the poorest quarter of American neighborhoods over consecutive generations, compared to just a tiny fraction of white families. And this is a finding that's not driven by wealth. It's not driven by income. Okay, if you look at black families making $100,000 or more, they live in more disadvantaged neighborhoods than white families making $30,000 or less. Okay, this is not a story about group differences in income or resources. It's a story about the intersection between race and segregation and all of the public policies that guaranteed there would be that intersection over time. I started to look at the consequences of this multi-generational pattern of differential exposure to the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. And a lot of the research that I do focuses on outcomes related to cognitive skills of kids for several reasons, but the main one is that this is just a really strong predictor of a whole range of different outcomes later in life. And so one of the findings from that first book is that if you want to explain differences in cognitive development, then you have to consider the impact of the residential environment. So this is everything that comes bundled up in a neighborhood, all the things that you work on, okay? Institutions, health, education, violence, pollution, everything that comes bundled up in where you live, okay? You have to consider the multi-generational experience of neighborhood inequality, neighborhood advantage and disadvantage in order to understand present-day differences in, for instance, achievement gaps or gaps in cognitive skill development. And so this was the focus of my first book. Now, as I was doing this research, I started to also learn the history. And I know Richard Rothstein, if you all were able to hear his talk, he just does an extraordinary job in his book of document. I thought I knew this history inside and out, and then I read his book and realized, I didn't know the half of it, the half of what's gone on. So when you read this history about the intentional, the conscious policies that have been developed to subsidize white Americans to leave poor or even mixed income communities, to pay them to try and find the most exclusive neighborhoods and the most expensive homes. The policies that are still in place, policies like the mortgage interest deduction, which I know a lot of us in the room probably benefit from it. It's a giveaway. It's a regressive giveaway. And it subsidizes people to live in the most exclusive neighborhoods and to buy the most expensive homes they can, and then to do everything they can to protect the value of their homes and make sure they can exclude other people who they think might lower their property value. For me, it's the most visible and just most shocking example of our priorities in the U.S. And I can't believe it still exists. It's so disturbing that I just moved to Princeton. I'm going to benefit from it for the first time in my life, and I'm still angry about it. I don't want this policy. I don't want the money that's going to come to me from this policy. Anyway, when I started to learn about this history and the policies that have been put in place to make sure white Americans left central city neighborhoods, mixed income neighborhoods, to pay them to leave, to extract resources from those neighborhoods left behind, to set up public housing in ways that would reproduce segregation, reinforce segregation, and then to pull resources from those public housing developments to ensure that they couldn't succeed. The policies that have been implemented to make sure that institutions in central city communities could not thrive, could not function, to make sure that those institutions would fall apart. The policies that have created the conditions for violence to emerge. Okay, when I started reading that history and then started to see hints about the impact that violence was having, and those hints came from several sources. So if you read the classic urban ethnographies, read Elijah Anderson's work in Philadelphia, where he talked about how violence had started to structure everyday interactions in the most segregated, poorest neighborhoods of Philadelphia. So kids were spending their time trying not to be victimized, trying to survive, instead of spending their time trying to learn, trying to do the things that, spending their time thinking about the things that my son thinks about as he gets to and from middle school, like who he's going to hang out with that day, what he's doing after school. This was a different world that Elijah Anderson was describing, where violence had taken over. The hints came from survey data. So every survey that's been done of families who volunteer for housing mobility programs, every survey that's been done asking why, what are those central reasons why they want to leave their community, has found that the top reasons are violence, drugs, and gangs. Every single survey that's been done over time. And I started to see these hints in the data that I was working with. Okay, so this is a map from Chicago. The neighborhoods are shaded by the level of poverty. And what I wrote about in my first book, Stuck in Place, was the impact of concentrated poverty, everything that comes with it. What I didn't fully realize is that that concentrated poverty was overlaid almost perfectly with concentrated violence. So all of these hints started pushing me to think about maybe violence is part of the reason, maybe violence is even a central reason why growing up in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods seems to have such damaging, long-lasting consequences on kids. So as a social scientist, my next step was try to figure out, can we get more concrete evidence? Can we get causal evidence to see if this is right? And so the first study I did looked, again, at cognitive skills. And what this graph shows you is just the average change in a common scale. This is a Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. So this is a common scale to measure the cognitive skills of kids, okay? And this is the average change that a child will experience over the age from 9 to 16. Then I set up a research design where the goal was to look at how kids perform on these assessments of cognitive skills if they are given the assessment just before versus just after a major incident of violence takes place near their home. Okay, so in this case, I looked at homicides. What happens if a kid is given an assessment of cognitive skills directly after a homicide occurs near the child's home? And the goal, again, was to get more concrete, tangible evidence on whether we can move from the kind of abstract and idea that living in violent communities affects every dimension of our lives. Can we get causal, concrete evidence to see whether there's a demonstrable, visible, causal impact on kids? And this first study I did showed that if kids were given these assessments of cognitive skills directly after a local homicide versus directly before, so it's pure chance when they're given the assessment, the kids who take the assessment just after score about 3 or 4 points lower than the kids who take the assessment just before, on average. So this is equivalent to missing roughly the past 2 years of schooling. This is the degree of damage that this incident does. This is the impact that it has on a child. Now, this impact was so large that I assumed it was wrong. And so we replicated this using the same design with an entirely different sample of kids, entirely different data set. The second time I did it, the magnitude of the impact was larger than it was in this first study. In subsequent years, this has been replicated over and over using a range of different outcomes in a range of different settings, using high-stakes assessments, low-stakes assessments at school, standardized tests. Similar research has been done in New York, LA, Chicago, in Mexico, in Brazil, during periods of intense gang violence. The findings have shown that kids don't just perform worse on these tests of cognitive skills, they're less likely to attend school in the aftermath of extreme violence. Violence affects kids' sleep. It affects their stress levels. It affects their executive function. So it's not that kids are less intelligent after an incident of extreme violence takes place. It's that they can't focus their attention on mundane tasks like a quiz that's given to them in first period. And there's evidence for this. In the aftermath of violence, kids are, we push this further, and this is a study with Sibel Raver, a developmental psychologist at NYU, where we found that part of the reason why kids were performing worse on these assessments of cognitive skills was because independent raters were saying, who had no idea what the study was about, were observing kids, and the kids who took the assessments after incidents of extreme violence had taken place were rated as having less ability to control their impulses while they took the test and to maintain their attention on the task at hand. Okay? So it's not that kids are less intelligent after violence, it's that they're less able to focus their mind on the task at hand. Violence gets into the mind of everyone within a community. Okay, that's a core finding from this set of studies that has now ballooned and is now 10 years of research that has accumulated, showing the same findings over and over. So as I started doing more and more of this research and seeing how consistent these findings were, I started to think of violence in a different way. I started to think of violence really as the fundamental challenge of cities. Not that all the other dimensions, all the other things that everyone in this room is working on are unimportant, but that nothing works, nothing is possible if public spaces are unsafe. The very idea of city life, where people come together, where public space is prioritized over private space, that idea breaks down when those spaces carry the threat of violence. Okay, so violence affects kids directly, and that's this top pathway on this diagram. But it also changes the character of a community. It makes it less likely that families are going to invest in a neighborhood, that parents are going to want to raise their kids in a neighborhood, that teachers are going to invest in a school district, that business owners are going to invest in a community, that residents are going to be willing to venture out into public space and go to that YMCA or that library. And instead, it makes it more likely that they'll retreat into their own homes. Okay, it changes the dominant actors in a community. So it's no longer about community leaders and religious leaders and parents out in public space. It's about law enforcement. Okay, there's a different, in private security, there's a different set of actors that come to be dominant and play a dominant role in public space when a place becomes violent. And then this reinforces the process of creating urban inequality. And the last link is from urban inequality here all the way back to violence. This thing creates a cycle that reinforces the prevalence of violence in a community. Now, this is what has led me to focus on violence over the past 6 or 7 years, and has really shifted my research agenda. At some point while I was doing this research, it kind of hit me that, okay, I'm making this empirical case, trying to build up this body of evidence, suggesting that violence is a fundamental challenge of cities, and yet at the same time, violence is going away all over the country. Something fundamentally different is happening in cities across the country. So let me give a sense of the scale of that change. You've all probably seen this graph. This just shows the murder rate in the US from 1960. This runs to 2015, but it's roughly the murder rate has stayed at about 5 murders for every 100,000 people to the present. And so what this shows is the period starting in the 1970s and continuing through the 1990s, where cities in the United States experienced a transformation and became intensely violent places. This happened all over the country, okay? And then it shows from the 1990s forward the sudden change that no one predicted at the time, that people are still battling to try to explain. But this sudden transformation, this drop of violence where the national level of violence fell roughly by half. And there's a lot of skepticism about this trend, and some of it for good reason. There are lots of examples of most of our data on violence comes from police department data reported to the FBI, and there are lots of examples of police departments that have played games with the data and manipulated the data. And that's a very real phenomenon that happens. But the trend is correct. Okay? Every source of data tells the exact same story. So the way you should think about data on violence in your city or in a particular place is that you can never be exactly sure what the number is for a given year, but you can usually trust the trend. Okay, the same sources of bias are usually there from one year to the next, and every source of data typically tells the same story, at least for measures of violence like the murder rate. Okay, and some other measures like motor vehicle theft and robbery are also measured very consistently. So to make that point, this is a survey of Americans that's been done since the 1970s and called the National Crime Victimization Survey. So if you don't trust the police department data, you should probably trust what Americans report. This is the percentage of Americans who report being assaulted over the past 6 months. And FBI data suggests that violence has fallen by roughly half, 45 to 50%. Data from Americans on whether they've been assaulted suggests that violence has fallen by at least 2/3, or up to 75%. So if anything, the police department data have underreported the degree of change that's taken place. And every source of data tells the same story. Data from hospitals, data on shootings tells the same story. Violence has fallen for every group at all levels of income. A quick comparison that reveals the scale of change we're talking about. So this top line is the victimization rate for the poorest group of Americans in this National Crime Victimization Survey. What I want to point out is that the victimization rate now for the poorest group of Americans is roughly equivalent to the victimization rate for the richest Americans back at the beginning of the early 1990s. That's a scale of change that we're talking about. This is a transformation of what it means to be poor in the United States. It means something very different than it did 25 years ago. The greatest changes have taken place in American cities. So this is a map of U.S. cities in 1993. This is actually an average over a few years in the early 1990s. And these, the circles with the darkest shades here are places that had a murder rate of at least 20 per 100,000 in 1993. So this is an extreme level of violence. Okay, I use this threshold just because it captures a different level of violence. Okay, a level that's only found in a small number of countries throughout the world. And in the early 1990s, this was the norm for urban America. About half of big cities across the country had murder rates at least as high as 20 per 100,000. Then there were some, including Atlanta, that had rates up over 40 and 50 murders for every 100,000. Places that were just dominated by the threat of violence. This is the same map in 2014. Okay, I'll show you that contrast again, if I can. 1993 and 2014. Okay, so violence hasn't gone away, and there are still cities, I mentioned a few at the outset, that still have extreme levels of violence. But these are the anomalies at this point. About half of big cities had extreme levels of violence in the early 1990s. Now it's about 10 to 15%. Okay, so across most of the country, there's been this dramatic change. And one of the questions that I often get is, well, where did this change take place? Who actually experienced a change in their communities? So we went out looking for how neighborhoods have changed. And we gathered data in as many cities as we could, which wasn't many, to be candid. But the question was to see, well, how have different neighborhoods, I lived a block south of Washington Square Park in Manhattan for the past 10 years. And, it's very easy to say, well, the crime dropped. obviously took place in Washington Square Park and Central Park and these very visible tourist spots, but did it really hit the neighborhoods in Queens and Brooklyn? Have they been touched by the crime drop? And what we found in all of the places where we've been able to track down data over a long period of time at a local level, at the neighborhood level, is that the greatest changes took place in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. So this graph, it's a little bit difficult to interpret, but just the comparison here is that these columns on the left are, so this is 6 cities laid out, and this is, just think of this as before the crime drop. And these columns on the left represent the violent crime rate in the neighborhood of the average poor resident of the city, okay? So this is like if you took the average poor resident of Chicago before the crime drop, this is the violent crime rate in that average poor person's neighborhood, compared to the violent crime rate in the average non-poor resident of Chicago's neighborhood, okay? So this is before the crime drop, and as you can see, there's just a fundamentally different experience depending on whether you're poor or non-poor in these 6 cities. This is after the crime drop, okay? There's still a difference. Poverty still comes with an increased threat of being exposed to community violence. But poor residents of these cities are living in different worlds. They're living in worlds that look a lot like the worlds of the non-poor residents of 20 years ago, 25 years ago, okay? This is the scale of change that has taken place. So a lot of the classics, I teach urban policy and urban poverty, and a lot of the classics that are often assigned on syllabi for these kinds of courses are studies done in a time from the 80s to the 90s where violence was either rising or was extremely high. This is our vision, I think, for anyone who's taken any of these courses in urban policy. This is our vision of what urban poverty looks like. I'm not arguing that it's gone away, but I think the changes that have taken place are sufficient to kind of provoke us to rethink what urban poverty looks like. And I'm certainly not arguing that poverty has gotten easier in any way. There are other challenges that have become more severe over time, and urban poverty is as difficult as it ever has been. At the same time, urban poverty used to come with the constant threat of violence in most cities across the country. Now, in most neighborhoods and most cities across the country, that's no longer true. So I think that's a fundamental shift in what city life means in the United States and what urban poverty means in the United States. And just as the greatest benefits, or the greatest changes have taken place in the most disadvantaged communities, the greatest benefits of these changes have been experienced by the most disadvantaged segments of the population. The easiest way to make this case is to just point to lives lost. So with a graduate student, Michael Friedson, what we did for this study is we calculated life expectancy using mortality data going back from 1991. We went through 2015. This graph ends at 2011, but we went through 2015. And we're only able to do this for 4 groups, white and black men and women, okay? So from this first graph, the things you want to notice are, A, there's extreme inequality in this basic measure of health. At the start of this period, white men lived on average 8 years longer. I just gave you the punchline too quickly. White men lived on average 8 years longer than black men, okay? Over this entire period, we've had the same inequality by gender and by race that has persisted over time. But the second thing you want to notice is that this gap has shrunk, okay? It's shrunk over the past 25 years, and the gap between white and black men has dropped from 8 years to about 5 years. So this is not, news to celebrate in the sense that there are still these enormous gaps and pretty shocking inequality. But this kind of change is very hard to generate and doesn't come about very often. So it's important to notice, even if we're nowhere near where any decent society would want to be, it still is important to notice the change that's taken place over the past 25 years. So the second part of this exercise is we wanted to create a thought experiment, which we generated with data, where we'd say, okay, how would life expectancy for these four groups look if mortality due to homicide never changed? Okay, so if the murder rate was the same now as it was in 1991, what would life expectancy look like? Okay, and so that's the second set of calculations represented by these dashed lines. And as you'll notice, for these three groups, for white women, black women, and for white men, homicide is not a major cause of death, and when we recalculated life expectancy, assuming homicide never fell, there's not a huge difference in life expectancy. For black men, there is a huge difference. The difference, if homicide mortality never fell, then life expectancy for black men would be about 4/5 of a year lower than it is today. I know this sounds underwhelming, okay? 4/5 of a year does not seem like a huge change. It is. I don't know how to convince people of this except to give examples. So there are no public health advancements that generate this type of change on their own. The best comparison, which I make in the book, is to the obesity epidemic. Okay, so obesity is seen as this national crisis, gets hundreds of millions of dollars in funding from NIH every year. And researchers who study the impact of obesity on life expectancy have estimated that if the problem went away tomorrow, if there was not one overweight person in the United States tomorrow, life expectancy would probably go up between 1/3 of a year and a year. So this is saying that the actual improvement in life expectancy that we've seen due to the drop in homicides is roughly equivalent or greater than the hypothetical improvement we would see if obesity was eliminated altogether tomorrow. That's the scale of change that has taken place. That's why I think of this as the most important public health advancement for black men of the past several decades. And we don't think about the crime drop in that way, but that's what it is. It is a breakthrough in public health. The crime decline hasn't just saved lives, it's made our schools dramatically safer. We are in a period where we have this hysteria around school shootings, and I get it. They are beyond horrific, but they mask the fact that our schools have become dramatically safer over the past 25 years. This graph just shows victimization rates for 12 to 18-year-olds report in school and out of school. And victimization in school has fallen by about 75% over the past 25 years. The rates at which kids report carrying weapons to school has plummeted over the past few decades. Okay, so this national crisis about school shootings is merited, but we also have to keep in mind that schools are safer than they have been in several decades. In the places where violence has fallen the most, academic achievement has improved the most. Okay, so at the start I showed you all this evidence on how violence affects kids' learning and kids' cognitive functioning. Well, we now have the second piece of that, which tells us that as violence falls, kids start to do better. Schools become places of learning again. And in the places where violence has fallen the most, that racial achievement gap has narrowed the most. This has changed the nature of schools where violence has fallen. The benefits then extend later into life. So someone from the Opportunity Insights team was here, is that right, at this conference? So this is using their data. Raj Shetty and his team have just done an incredible service to the research community, to the world, really making these data available. So this, looking at upward mobility from near the bottom of the distribution, which is the same figures that you probably saw in the Opportunity Insights presentation. We then looked at how exposure to violence during childhood affects the likelihood of upward mobility. Okay, and this is just a cross-sectional graph, but what this tells you is that the places that have the lowest rates of upward mobility are the places where kids are spending their childhoods in the most violent environments. And you can see Detroit and Chicago and Atlanta in the data on the right tail as places where kids spent their childhoods in very violent environments and were the least likely to move upward in the income distribution. Now, we need to take a second step and assess whether this is causal. So we exploited a few natural experiments trying to harness exogenous changes in when crime falls, the timing of when crime falls, and we looked at kids in successive cohorts in places where crime was falling to see if this is causal. And the conclusion from this analysis is that when crime falls during childhood by 30 to 40%, which was about the typical rate of change for cohorts born in the 1980s, kids on average can expect to move upward in the income distribution by 2 or 3 points, which means they're making $2,000 or $3,000 more per year, which for a substantial number of kids starting in low-income families means they're moving out of poverty. So it's the causal effect of declining violence during childhood is that kids their upward mobility rises to a degree where it looks like they are it's the equivalent to being raised in Denver as opposed to Chicago in terms of their chance for moving upward in the income distribution. Okay, so I only have a couple minutes, so I'm going to move a little quicker in these last few slides. So this is a very positive story so far of how violence has affected different segments of the population. We all know that's not the entire story. So just as the greatest benefits of the crime drop have been experienced by the most disadvantaged segments of the population, so have the greatest costs of the methods that we've relied on for the past several decades to deal with violence. And those costs have come in intensive surveillance targeted toward low-income communities of color, the expansion of video surveillance, private security, law enforcement. So this graph just shows the rise of law enforcement. But there's also the new tactics of law enforcement. Those changes have come in the form, most notably, of mass incarceration, where the incarceration rate in state and federal prisons for the entirety of our nation's history had hovered around 100 prisoners for every 100,000 people until the 1970s, at which point it skyrocketed and rose by 500%. And it has declined a little bit, but it is still roughly at that rate now. So when we consider the benefits that have come with crime drop and the staggering costs that have come with the methods that we've relied on to deal with violence, we're left with a few questions. First, how can we preserve and extend the decline of violence so that it reaches every city and every neighborhood across the country? Second, and more important, how can we do so with a different approach? How can we do so with an approach that no longer relies on the police and the prison as our default responses to violence? And third, how can we make sure that original residents can remain in place and benefit from the changes that take place around them that in many cases they have worked to generate? Those are the questions that I grapple with in the end of the book. I want to give you one last piece of evidence, and I'll do this quickly, because this is very relevant to what all of you are doing in the room. When we sat down a few years ago, I sat down with 3 graduate students, and we were unsatisfied with explanations for why crime dropped. And so we gathered data on everything we could about how cities were changing in the 1990s when violence was falling. And we saw the rise in police, we saw the rise in incarceration and private security and video surveillance. We saw all of that in the data. And then we saw something else. We gathered data on we used the data that the Urban Institute had gathered on the nonprofit sector all over the country. And we looked at how different kinds of nonprofits had changed. And what we found was something that I had no idea occurred. There was a proliferation of community-oriented nonprofits that took place in the 1990s at the same time that violence started to fall. This just shows anti-violence nonprofits. This graph shows the yearly growth. This is not the total number. This is the growth from year to year. In the 1990s, the number of the growth in anti-violence nonprofits started to skyrocket, okay? So what happened in East Lake is often seen as like stories like this are told about different places in the country. They are told about inspiring leaders, about the incredible work that individuals have done. And those people should be celebrated. But what we found is that this was actually a national story. This was going on in neighborhoods all over the country. And it worked best in places that had incredible leaders like Eva Davis. But it worked to a smaller extent in lots of places across the country. There was a national proliferation of community-oriented organizations. And so with these graduate students, we developed methods to identify whether this proliferation of community-oriented nonprofits had any impact on the crime job. Again, whether it was causal. And what we found is that in a typical city, and it's in a city with 100,000 residents, every 10 additional nonprofits that are specifically focused on building stronger communities, confronting violence, led to about a 9% drop in the murder rate, a slightly smaller drop in the overall violent crime rate and property crime rates. And this has been left out of debates about why violence fell. This is not only reinforced by the stories that we hear about what different organizations are doing in different communities, it's now reinforced by a set of experimental evaluations of nonprofit organizations and their programs that has grown over time. Okay, this has been one of the challenges of understanding the impact of the nonprofit sector, is that there just aren't many programs that are evaluated in a particularly rigorous way. Well, now this body of evidence is growing, okay? And so cognitive behavioral therapy, summer jobs, business improvement districts, we don't think of as community development, but also has a causal impact on violent crime. And these are nonprofit organizations, okay? And then this study from Philadelphia that a lot of you have probably heard about, these are examples of a body of evidence suggesting that this national story is not anomalous. There are programs going on all over the country, and we now have a sufficient body of evidence to suggest that these programs have an extraordinary impact on violence. Okay, so let me conclude. 5 conclusions here, the first 4. The first, violence is a fundamental challenge of urban America. Secondly, violence has plummeted over the past 25 years. Third, the fall of violence has had its greatest impact on the most disadvantaged communities and its greatest benefits on the most disadvantaged segments of the population. Fourth, at the same time, the staggering costs of the methods that we've used to deal with violence have also been borne by the most disadvantaged segments of the population and the most disadvantaged communities. That leads to the last conclusion, which I'll leave you with. For the past 50 years, we've relied on a model of dealing with the problem of violence and the related problems of urban poverty, urban inequality, with a model that relies on abandonment and punishment. We have relied on the police and the prison. Even now, when most conversations about how to deal with violence start with law enforcement and the criminal justice system, we now have a sufficient body of evidence to suggest that another model is not only possible, but will be more effective. Okay, we now have a sufficient model of evidence to move from a model driven by punishment to one driven by investment. And that new model has to be driven by a new set of actors, okay? And I think the actors that are in this room, we now have, this is not because I'm talking to Purpose-Built Communities Conference, you know, this is not a conclusion driven by how I think the world should work. This is a conclusion driven by a body of evidence that has emerged over time and that I deeply believe in. Body of evidence that is causal, that has been supported and reinforced as the evidence has grown. We now have sufficient evidence to propose a model to deal with violence that is built around residents and community organizations. These are the groups and people that have always had the greatest capacity to control violence, to build stronger communities, but have never been given the same resources and the same commitment to make that change, okay? So I'll conclude by just saying it's now time for that change. We now have the body of evidence to support all of the work that you're doing. So thanks for having me, and we have, I think, 10 minutes or so for questions.
Thank you so much. It's very moving to think that problems like this can be addressed. My name's Dr. Arthur Lavin with the American Academy of Pediatrics. And David Bellinger at Harvard and Bruce Lampier in Vancouver informed me that their data on lead abatement suggests that 60% of the drop in crime in the United States is attributable to taking lead out of commercial and personal automobiles and paint. Do you have a sense of what the scale of the impact of lead is?
Yeah, so lead is, the drop in lead exposure, I think, is just this incredible public health breakthrough. And there's no doubt that lead has tremendous benefits, particularly for kids' developmental outcomes. And I think there is some good evidence for a causal impact on crime. The biggest challenge with not the biggest challenge, the biggest problem with attributing the decline in crime to lead is that, so there's a very specific theory about how lead affected crime, which is that there were specific cohorts of kids who were raised in, at moments where the degree of lead in the air and the degree of lead in paint plummeted very quickly. So it's an explanation that is driven entirely by comparisons of cohorts of kids over time who are exposed to more and less lead. And then you look 20 years later and you look at how crime changed, and that's how the lead argument is made. The biggest problem is that beginning in the early 1990s, everyone started committing less violence. So the changes that took place, when you look at different cohorts of the population, everyone started committing less crime, and crime rates went down among all age groups. So it wasn't limited to the groups that were affected by the changes in lead exposure during childhood. So that doesn't mean that lead didn't play a role. I think the drop in lead, just on its own, it's a incredible breakthrough, and it probably contributed to the crime drop. But there's much more evidence that something changed for everyone at the same time. There's much more evidence that something in the environment, it's a period change as opposed to a cohort change, if that makes sense. So you have to have this new, or my at least perspective is this nuanced perspective that I do think lead probably has a causal effect on crime, but I don't think the drop in lead explains why crime fell.
Hey, Pat, thanks so much for this. This is such an important set of information to provide, particularly to this group. But I was working for Shirley when we were in the midst of that huge drop in crime in Atlanta that you were showing on your slides. And at the time, we were getting a lot of pressure, particularly from the police chief, to sort of take credit for this. You know, it's like, we're doing great work. And I was at the time charged with analyzing performance data for the city. And I could never attach any of that decline with anything that city government was doing. It was very, and sorry, Shirley, but there was really nothing you could say that this was an activity that we did, and this was the decline in crime that we were seeing as a consequence of it. In fact, there was big debates at the time about whether we should be increasing the police force, and yet I couldn't see any relationship between the size of the police force with crime reduction. So you said in your talk, you used a term in here that I wanted to press you on, because you said at one point earlier in your talk, you said there were conditions that allow violence to emerge. And we're actually working, Robert Wood Johnson just announced this week, to try to answer the question. We're working then to answer the question, what do we mean by that? What are these conditions that generate not only crime outcomes, but also education outcomes, health outcomes? I was wondering, if you could, this is kind of an unfair question, but if I were to drop you into a neighborhood, how would you begin to assess the conditions of that neighborhood? What ways would you either try to measure it or assess whether those conditions are prevailing that are creating these kinds of outcomes.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a difficult question, but I do think the way I put it is when a community is abandoned, it creates the conditions for violence to emerge. So that abandonment usually starts with policy, when resources are extracted, and then down the road you see institutions start to deteriorate, meaning religious congregations start to empty out, schools start to crumble, public parks are no longer maintained, public housing developments start to become more and more dilapidated. That means people stop spending time out in public space and retreat to their homes. And so, you know, I feel like I can get a sense of it when I drive through a neighborhood and just talk to people, but it's not, you know, almost all of my work is quantitative, and I don't have a quantitative answer for when it happens. It's when I'm going through a neighborhood and I ask questions like, okay, well, you know, who's in charge in this neighborhood? Who do you go to if there's something that you need for your kids, or if you have a question, or if you're not sure, you know, where to go to get English language instruction or tax prep help, you know, whatever it is. Who runs this neighborhood? Who's in charge? And when a community is abandoned, when the basic institutions that every community relies on as the foundation for public life, when those start to wither away, that's when a space becomes vulnerable to violence. It doesn't happen everywhere, but that's when it can happen. And so that idea of abandoned communities is the one that I return to, because that's what happened from the 70s to the 80s. That's what happened in cities all across the country, and it wasn't an accident. You know, that's what happened when the federal government extracts resources and refuses to fund public housing. They fall, you know, places fall apart, people retreat, and that creates the conditions for violence.
Yeah, thanks for that. This is I'm Phil Hissom with the Polis Institute. I guess my question's on the flip side. If you've done research on some of those conditions, specific interventions the nonprofits are doing, one of the communities we first worked in 09 to 13, it was our highest crime block in Central Florida, like 2 violent incidents a month. And just through community engagement work, that completely ceased for about 30 months. It's since leaked back in about 1 or 2 a year. So there were no police interventions at all. We did very specific things, but they weren't big productions. So I didn't know if you've done research on the intervention side to, like, you know, what kind of works best to create the conditions for violent cessation.
Yeah, I haven't done that work, to be honest. I mean, I've done national studies where I've tried to kind of provide the national evidence to support and to kind of provide the evidence behind all of the work that you're doing in particular communities. But I do think someone made the point yesterday that it's specific to the community, you know, what the actual challenges are and the problems are that are creating the conditions for violence to emerge. And so I think the biggest factors are having an outward-looking organization or set of organizations. You know, you guys call it a community quarterback here, and I've borrowed that term a few times, but having that kind of organization that looks outward and takes responsibility for public space and every resident within it and says, okay, we're in charge here, we're responsible, we're gonna make sure no one is falling through the cracks. We're gonna make sure that, you know, if a house is vacated, then it's not going to look like it's falling apart. We're not going to let people have parties there, and it's not going to take the neighborhood downhill with it. You know, if those kinds of institutions emerge, and they can be churches, they can be teachers and leaders in a school, particularly community-oriented schools. They can be residents who come together. It can be a whole different set of actors, but that's, I think, again, getting back to the question about what allows for violence to emerge. The presence of those kinds of institutions, I think, is the best predictor of a neighborhood that will not go downhill. Now, what you actually do, you know, you all will have to tell me. I'm not in a position to tell you.
Thank you.
All right, I think we have to start. Thank you.
That was tremendous.
Thank you.